How do we tell stories in ways that liberate ourselves? If I can build the story up that invokes an emotion, then there's a certain change that'll take place in the mindsets of people. Most of our poems are initiated by real events, real people, real experiences. And I think sometimes the poetry platform or the open mic is not the place to talk about that, but here we have an opportunity to break those down and talk through those. I gotta hurt to write. It's kind of my Achilles heel. The type of writing I be doing could hurt my rights. Ride the wave of this pain to keep this art alive until I hit a brick, get desperate, and start to self-afflict. I can't be silent neither. The neurosis encroaches, the I don't know-ness of microaggressions keep my mind focused. I'm a Mary J. Blige kind of poet. I gotta be beated on and cheated on to hit my best vibe kind of poet. Hit the pinnacle of my creative emotion and chaos and commotion kind of poet. But I don't really want to experience what it would normally take to write this poem. My name is Marmi the Griot, and today we want to talk about the art of storytelling. I first came to storytelling. If you don't know this about me, I am an ordained minister, actually. And I fell in love with what the church would call the old story. And it was that story that made me really fall in love with stories. Like what kind of stories people tell, what kind of stories are told about us, and also how do we tell stories in ways that liberate ourselves, that help us to get away from certain harmful ideas about people. And I think that's been my work. That's part of like one of the reasons I write poetry is because I want to tell stories that maybe counter certain dominant narratives, certain popular narratives. I heard one poet say that sometimes the best poetry is covers the stories in between, or the in-between stories. So it's like, what can you say that's not being said? Oftentimes, like for example, I write love poems a lot. And there are certain just ways in which we talk about men and women. We talk about relationships. We talk about people's faults and failures. And sometimes if you tell a good story, you can turn all that on its head. And you can open up more possibilities for people to really envision a new world and a new way of being. This has been a thing, even like, again, back to, my upbringing in the church, specifically an African-American church, where, the Bible stories were turned on their heads. We talked about having a hermeneutic of suspicion, which is essentially just having a perspective that is suspicious when you hear certain stories. But then it gives you the creative liberty to be able to rewrite them in ways that are helpful to you. For example, if we talk about the Exodus story, which is this narrative about the people of Israel leaving the bondage of Egypt. And some people might say that what does this say about the God of the Exodus, right? That he is the God of the oppressed. So the way in which we flip story or change story or even manipulate story can be harmful or helpful, which is why one of the reasons I started a platform for men who do poetry is because there's a lot of like poems that only share one side of men and masculinity in relationship. And I wanted to open up a space where we could tell different stories, more radical stories that enliven and enlarge how we understand each other, how we relate to each other, and what we believe about one another. They say, I once heard a preacher say that if you're going to preach the gospel, for example, then you ought to be able to tell the story in a way that a 5-year-old can understand it. And so, that's the other essence of storytelling is it communicates to all levels of being, all ages, all ranges, and it's transformative that way. Because people, even marketing and business worlds, they follow the story. So it's like if you fall in love with the story. I'm a romantic, and if you're a poet, you probably are too. And part of being a romantic is you can just make up a story about the smallest thing. Like I remember I remember just gracing the hand of a woman one time, and I wrote a whole poem about it, right? Because it's just the story that it could have been, the possibility of it, which also might be my downfalls. If you romanticize, you know what I mean about like the ways in which romanticizing things can set you up for issues, but also that's your ability to create the story. And then eventually, even it leads into our like mental health and things like that. It's like, what stories are we telling ourselves that are harmful? I debated a couple poets over the last week over the subject of old poems get no attention. And the reality of it is like we all love our old poems. But I got to a place with this specific poem where it wasn't the most honest poem. And I didn't want to keep reiterating a story that wasn't true. It's okay if it's fantasy. It's okay if it's made up. But I just didn't want to reiterate a story that's untrue. So I came up with this idea, like, what if we kind of left the old poems behind so that new poems could evolve? So that new stories would evolve. Which kind of feeds into my whole theory about art and poetry anyway, is that art is life. And as long as you're living, you'll keep having more things to write about. Which is why we don't have to covet what we've written about in the past. Because the story continues. We're always writing ourselves into the larger story of life. So storytelling, for me, again, I could say I was a church kid, but also I am very much a hip hop head too. So like my favorite rappers are the storytellers. There's a whole tradition from, Scarface is my favorite storyteller. DMX is a very good storyteller. They rap in ways that you can enter in to what they're talking about, the world they live in. And it leads into the way I write my poems. Like, people have told me, like, you really told the story. Actually, this whole idea, this whole concept, as I've been meditating on it, came from a coach of mine, a poetry coach of mine, who said that, I was going to tell the story. That when the foundations were destroyed and the infrastructure was dismantled, that my village would last, because I would tell the story in a way that we never forgot ourselves, that we never stopped learning about who we are, that erasure didn't happen to us because we preserved the story, that my village would preserve the story because I'm that kind of griot. And I think that's what I seek to do with my poetry, is to preserve the stories that are liberative, the ones that give us hope, the ones that encourage us, the ones that lead us. Some of my favorite poets are really good storytellers. Like my friend Artistic Genius is an excellent storyteller. Actually has a book out right now and just really kind of leading. I actually have a feature in it, or a feature in the beginning. And she talks through a whole funeral procession, and you can really kind of just be in the space and just hear it, and just kind of you enter into the story. My OG Jesus Hampton, who has really taught me a lot about poetry, also is a great storyteller. Like, I was at his last feature, and I could really kind of enter into the story. And there's a way in which that does something to us. I think in the poetry experience, it allows us to be able to see what's possible. For example, we live in a time where like things are just really like numbing, and people are numb, and poetry has a way to help people feel. But sometimes they have to be able to visualize it. They have to be able to see what's possible. They have to be able to see worlds that are possible. And we do world making through storytelling. It's like, how would you ever have some of the things that we have in our world if somebody didn't sell a narrative about it? There's a narrative about what poor people, even policy is built around narrative. It's like, if I can build the story up that invokes an emotion, then there's a certain change that'll take place in the mindsets of people. And I think that's why it's so important to be able to tell stories and preserve stories, because just as a person of color, I know that we're in a time where our stories specifically are being erased. And it's like, as a father, I never want my children not to know who they are. And I come from an oral tradition where story was passed down, before we had any type of technology that preserved that, where you can retain information. It was the oral tradition, the passing down. I think probably the oral tradition is probably as old as poetry. The way in which words are passed down, stories are passed down, legacies are passed down. I've got poems talking about my family that come from stories that I've heard about certain family members, that I've heard about the way in which people navigated hard situations. And it builds up a resilience in me because I know that I come from a people who survived. And it's because I've heard the stories and been with the people. The best poem is the dopest poem is the honest poem. And it's like, you get these stories from your own lives, which is if you look up Miguel Pinero, who is a New York poet that started the Norican Cafe. He basically said, we don't have to write poems about things that we don't experience. We can write about, I'm paraphrasing, but he said we can write about the stories that we're actually living. And Pinero was living a tough life in New York, so his poems reflected that roughness. It reflected the essence of what he was going through. And I think these are the ways in which we can communicate. Again, it comes back to hope and encouragement for one another. Because I can talk about what I've been through via poetry and it becomes impactful for you. So the preservation of story is just, I think the preservation of story and then you get into radical storytelling. So how can we then up the ante and not maintain the same stories that are problematic and harmful, but even invite new stories, reimagining new ways of thinking about scenarios and incidents and things like that. That becomes radical storytelling. That way you can start to pick out new villains or new heroes. They say the old African proverb is if the lion was a historian, then the hunter wouldn't always be the hero. This is a culture we want to preserve. This is an art form we want to preserve and has been preserved. We're not the first ones to do it, right? Because we've passed down code. We've passed down, practice. We passed down craft, tools, and ways of being and ways of doing. And so, I just hope we never lose that. We come to you with the Ohio Griots podcast, and basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be digging into, we're going to talk to poets about their poems and the stories that undergird them. We're going to talk about the stories that made them as poets, but also the stories that made the poems. Because we all know that if you write poetry, that most of our poems are initiated by real events, real people, real experiences. And I think sometimes the poetry platform or the open mic is not the place to talk about that. But here we have an opportunity to break those down and talk through those.